Steel-gray light seeped into the streets of Susa as shutters opened and vendors laid out their goods. But in certain houses, no one went to work. Jewish families stood in narrow rooms, hands wrapped around spears, sticks, or kitchen knives. Fathers checked the edges of borrowed swords. Mothers counted children. This was the 13th day of Adar, the date written in a royal decree as the day anyone in the empire could attack them. Another decree now allowed them to fight back. Whether this day ended in slaughter or survival would be decided in the alleys below. The road to that morning began months earlier. In the palace at Susa, King Xerxes had raised a man named Haman to a rank above all other officials and ordered everyone at the gate to bow when he passed. One man refused. Mordecai the Jew stayed upright each time Haman walked by. Learning who he was, Haman decided that killing one man was not enough. He wanted to strike at Mordecai's entire people. Haman went to the king with a complaint. There was, he said, a scattered people spread through the provinces, keeping their own laws and not obeying the king's commands. He argued that it was not in the king's interest to tolerate them, and offered a vast sum of silver if he could deal with them. Xerxes, thinking little of distant minorities, took off his signet ring and gave it to Haman. "Do with them as seems best to you," he said. Scribes were summoned. Under Haman's direction, they wrote letters in the languages of the empire, authorizing officials and citizens to destroy, kill, and wipe out all Jews, young and old, women and children, on a single day, the 13th of Adar. Couriers sped out. In city after city, announcements appeared in public squares. Inside the palace, the king and Haman sat down to drink. Outside, among the Jews, there was fasting and fear. Mordecai tore his clothes, put on sackcloth, and stood at the gate. News of his condition reached his cousin Esther, who lived inside the palace. Years earlier, she had been chosen as queen, hiding her Jewish identity. Through a go-between, he sent her a copy of the decree and told her plainly she had to go to the king and plead for her people. Esther understood the danger. No one approached Xerxes without being summoned. To do so was to risk death unless he extended his golden scepter, and she had not been called in 30 days. Mordecai answered that silence would not spare her. She asked the Jews of Susa to fast for 3 days with her and promised that after that she would go to the king. "If I perish," she said, "I perish." On the 3rd day, she dressed in royal robes and stood in the inner court facing the throne room. Guards watched as Xerxes saw her. For a moment, everyone waited. Then the king held out the scepter. Esther approached, touched its tip, and heard him ask what she wanted. She did not yet accuse Haman. Instead, she invited the king and Haman to a private banquet, and at that meal invited them to another the next day. Between those banquets, Haman left the palace thrilled with his new closeness to the king, only to see Mordecai again at the gate, still refusing to bow. Enraged, he boasted at home about his honors, but said none of it mattered while Mordecai lived. His family advised him to build a high stake and ask for permission to execute Mordecai on it in the morning. At the second banquet, Xerxes again asked Esther for her request. This time she spoke directly. She said that she and her people had been sold to destruction, slaughter, and annihilation, and that if they had only been sold as slaves, she would have remained silent. The king, shocked, demanded to know who had done this. Esther pointed across the room. "The adversary and enemy is this vile Haman." Xerxes rose in anger and walked out into the garden. Haman, knowing his life now depended on Esther, fell toward her couch to beg. When the king returned and saw him leaning over the queen, he snapped. Guards covered Haman's face. One of the officials mentioned the stake Haman had built for Mordecai. Xerxes ordered that Haman be impaled on it. The man who had planned a kingdom-wide slaughter died on the device meant for Mordecai. His estate was given to Esther. Mordecai was promoted and received the ring the king had once handed to his enemy. But the letters Haman had written still stood. The date he had chosen on the calendar still waited. Esther went to the king again, this time weeping at his feet and begging him to stop the plan against her people. Xerxes extended the scepter once more and told her and Mordecai to write another decree as they saw fit, sealing it with his ring. They could not erase the earlier law. Persian decrees once written stayed in force and could not be erased, but they could counter it. Scribes were called again. Mordecai dictated a new order giving the Jews in every city the right to assemble, to protect their lives, and to strike those who came to kill them on that same 13th day of Adar. Couriers rode out carrying letters that turned fear into guarded hope. In the months that followed, Jewish communities prepared quietly. Men who had never fought practiced with swords or clubs. Families weighed which neighbors might stand with them and which might turn against them. Officials in many provinces saw that Mordecai now held power and chose to support the Jewish defenders or stayed neutral. Others, who had long resented their Jewish neighbors or hoped to profit from their downfall, waited for the date printed on the royal decree. When Adar arrived, tension gripped the empire. Instead of frightened households, attackers in Susa met organized resistance. The Jews banded together, taking their stand in the streets and markets. When armed men moved toward their neighborhoods, they were met with force. The text does not dwell on the motions of every blow, but it records the outcome. On that first day in Susa, 500 of those who sought to kill them were killed, including the 10 sons of Haman, who had thrown their loyalty behind their father's cause. Reports reached the palace. Xerxes told Esther how many had died in the capital and asked what more she desired. She requested that the Jews in Susa be allowed to stand on guard again the next day, and that the bodies of Haman's sons remain displayed as a warning. He agreed. On the 14th of Adar, fresh attacks were met with the same determined defense. More enemies died. Still the Jews refused to touch the plunder. They were not there to loot, only to keep their families alive. Across the provinces, the pattern repeated. Groups who tried to carry out Haman's old decree found that their targets were armed and allowed to fight back. Governors and officers, recognizing Mordecai's influence, helped the Jewish communities or held back. According to the record, 75,000 of those who hated them were killed throughout the empire, apart from the numbers in Susa. Again, the text notes that the Jews did not seize the property of those who fell. Their battle stopped at survival. As the noise of conflict faded, different cities marked the outcome on different days. In the rural towns and smaller settlements, where the fighting lasted only a single day, the 14th of Adar became a time of rest and feasting in their streets. In Susa, where the Jews had fought on both the 13th and 14th, they celebrated on the 15th. Mordecai wrote down what had happened and sent letters to establish these days as an annual remembrance. Families were to feast, send portions of food to one another, and give gifts to the poor, so they would not forget how close they had come to being wiped out. The pattern stayed. Parents told their children how a royal official had tried to erase them with a line of text and a sealed ring, how a queen risked her life by stepping uninvited into a throne room, and how scattered families in distant cities picked up weapons because the law had left them no other choice. The story remained, told in scrolls and at crowded tables, about the time when Jews across Persia faced coordinated attacks and answered them with organized defense, turning a planned massacre into a hard-won deliverance that would be remembered for generations. Thank you for listening to Divine Crime. Subscribe for more true stories from the most dangerous book ever written.